So Cam, a wee bit of your background, please, to start off before we get into the presentation would be great.
Sure, no worries. I grew up in Rotorua. I've always had a passion for wild things. Don't know why. I did a lot of fishing with my dad as a young fella. I lived on the outskirts of Rotorua near the Utahina stream, where I was a very keen trout fisherman. I always loved nature, and I always loved wildlife, and I always wanted to be a wildlife officer. That was my dream. I went to university and studied ecology, and I got a job with the Forest Service, environmental forestry, as a hunter, and spent 5 years after university living in the bush, doing all sorts of research, forest research, deer research. So I developed a background in forest ecology. I morphed into dock rangership when there was a government change in the 80s. Forest Service Environmental Wing became dock, and I became a dock ranger. Did a lot of work on seal and kiwi. Pest management, still kept a love of sika deer. That's probably one of my greatest passions. I've been a sika deer researcher for almost 40 years, and I'm still learning. And I guess as an ecologist, that's one thing that you do know, that the more you learn, the more you've got lots more to learn. So I did a stint with ePro Limited in Taupo as operations manager, doing 1 million hectares of pest control every year, before I moved into the energy industry to work on environmental management around the Tongadiddle and Waikaremoana power schemes, working particularly with seal and tuna eels. I run my own contracting business, helping various landowners and groups around the country with all sorts of wildlife issues. So now I feel like I live the dream of playing with wildlife professionally. I have a small property here in Turangi on the outskirts, a few acres, but it's lovely. The only downside is very, very poor internet connection.
Yes. Oh, you're doing fine, though. We're at least using the phone, the string phone and the two cans, so we're getting there. Okay, let's go to your presentation then. And I do see there's a few people that if you've got the earlier Internet Explorer on your computer, it can have play havoc with being able to receive sound. So what we've got is down on the right-hand side of the screen, we have some lovely folk that often help anybody who have questions about sound or vision to try and clear it up as we go through this. So I do thank people in advance, which is cool. That's, and some of our people with Predator-Free New Zealand Trust, such as Jesse or Beck, will write any little wee notes that will help us get through this and the technology available and not so available in some parts of New Zealand. All right, Cam, I'm moving across now to your presentation. So I'm ready to change the slides, and away you go. Slide number 1 is up.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about my take on predator management today, and I'll note right from the start that I don't know everything, and there are an army of people out there with knowledge and skill and innovation which are driving predator-free New Zealand towards that very ballsy vision of a predator-free 2050. I just hope that my little understanding of a few things might strike a chord with a few of you. I'm not trying to teach anyone how to suck eggs. This is just my take on it. Predator management, how we can get it right in my view. Let's roll it off with the first slide. And I love this slide. This, to me, encapsulates what community predator management is all about. These are volunteers from the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation in the glacial valleys of remotest, deepest, darkest Fiordland. The Worsley, the Glasmilk, the Lugraburn, there's over 450 tracks in these valleys on something like 50 kilometres of trap lines, $60,000 investment in infrastructure, thousands of hours of volunteer time building, installing and checking traps, sponsorship of helicopter access. This really does encapsulate the multifaceted community engagement with predator-free. Hats off to the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation for that extreme level of effort that they're going to. This is probably as extreme as it gets for volunteers in a community predator management. So very proud of my work with the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation and the work that these guys do. So Next slide, I want to just talk about what it's all about. And this is a photo of a flock of kiddidu on Hauturu, Little Barrier Island. This is what New Zealand used to look like, and I'm sure this is how we would love it all to be again in the future. But without predator control, we won't ever realise that. So in the next slide, however, this is a photo taken last spring on the roadway outside my house. I've been on my property for 25 years, and when I first moved here, I never saw kiddidu. Now it's not uncommon for me to see 10 flocks of 10 in my kowhai trees and on the broom on the roadside outside my house. That's after 25 years of predator management across the Central North Island at a landscape scale. So we do know that predator management does work, and we do know that it can bring back these special treasures. So I love things like this, and this is what drives me in terms of predator-free. If we move to the next slide, these are the key things that I'd like to talk about today, the strategy behind predator management. A few things listed there. First one, and I guess we're all here because we can't do nothing. Doing nothing is not an option, so we're going to get out there, boots and all, and do the best we can. In doing that, those are the few things we need to remember. One is it's not about the numbers. I work with a number of community groups, and tails hanging on the fence might make you feel good, but it's actually not how many you kill that's important, it's how many are still left to do the damage that's most important. And I think that's a really important lesson for us all to keep in the front of our mind, that it's not about how many tails hanging dead on the fence, it's about the outcomes we're pursuing by keeping the numbers that are still out in the bush as low as possible. To do that, we've got to know our predator. And while we might dislike what our predators do, it doesn't give us a license to be inhumane and treat them poorly. So animal welfare is a really important thing. Public acceptability really does depend on animal welfare. And our social license to pursue predator-free really does rely on us all having an acknowledgement that these animals don't do what they do deliberately. It's just who they are and what they are. And it's not up to us to treat them cruelly or in any poor, inhumane way. So I really want to stress that. In terms of dealing to them, attention to detail is how we do it right. We've got to treat every trap like our life depends on setting it. And only then will our approaches be sustainable. So that's a sort of overview of what I want to talk about today. Hope that all makes sense. And hopefully as we work through it, we can make some sense. So the three things I really want to focus on today are an outcome focus, knowing your predator, and that attention to detail about setting every trap like your life depends on it. So we'll kick off with an outcome focus. There are many ways to control predators. They've all got advantages and limitations and consequences. There's no silver bullet. And I think it's a really important thing to know that you've got to mix it up, that there's no one size fits all. It's about using the right tool in the right place in the right way. And all of us have got stuff to learn in that respect. Next slide, the totoi here, the little robin. Robins are one of the things we can get back in our small patches of forest with a focus on rats. If we can get our rodent tracking index below 5%, you will see totoi, robins, bush robins coming back in your little patches of forest. So this is the outcome focus that I'm talking about, is it's not how many rats you kill, it's to make sure that your rodent tracking indices, for every 100 tunnels you set in your little patch of forest, you only get rat tracks in less than 5 of them. You'll be able to see robins coming back within 1 or 2 seasons. If we move to the next slide and we look at kiddidu, this is a little bit more complicated. Possums steal their food and steal their egg and they eat their chicks. So do rats. Rats steal their egg and eat their chicks. So at a landscape scale of thousands of hectares, we've got to keep rodents down to that very low 5% or less level, and possums down to less than 5% over those larger landscapes, because kiddidu are far more mobile. So this is the focus we need, is on the outcomes, not the possum tails hanging on the fence, not the rat tails hanging on the fence. How many are left to do the damage? I hope that makes sense, because it's a key driver for getting possum control and rat control and stoat control right. The next slide, we'll move into knowing your predator. And I think the three predators that most of us are focused on, rats, stoats, and possums, are very, very different critters. They come from different parts. They do different things. They live different lifestyles. And it's really important for us in the pest control game to understand things like home ranges and breeding rates and dispersal ranges. Rats, they live relatively small areas, a hectare or less. So you've got to keep your devices pretty tight, less than 100 metres, often 75 metres apart, to make sure that all your rats are at risk. Stoats, on the other hand, they operate over a landscape of hundreds of hectares. So, we know that we can only need about 6 or 7 or 8 stoat traps in the home range of 100 or 200 hectares, and we can make a difference, taking the top off the stoat population. Possums are a little bit in between. Most possums have a home range of several hectares. But again, their behaviours and their dispersal ranges differ. Stoats can disperse tens of kilometres. Possums only 1 or 2 kilometres. Rats, maybe a kilometre at most. So, they're all different. Their breeding rates, a single female rat pregnant at the start of spring can result in hundreds of rats through a good summer. Stoats, a female pregnant as she leaves her natal den might account for a dozen or maybe 14 or 15 stoats the following spring. Possums, mostly though, 1 offspring produced a year, 2 at best. So these animals breed at different rates, they disperse in different distances, they all use the habitats differently, and what drives them is different. Possums are sometimes not the sharpest tools in the shed. They'll come and get caught in a trap a couple of times before learning the lesson. But we all know the proverbial outhouse rat, one little scare and that rat becomes very, very hard to trap. Likewise with stoats, they're very cautious creatures. When I was working for EPRO, we did some work for Carolyn King, and we looked at videoing stoat and ferret interactions with different devices, tracking tunnels, live traps, kill traps, and over 77% of encounters with a device did not result in a detection or a capture. So the take-home message from that is 1 in 5 stoats might not go in your device, or probably more importantly, the stoat or ferret or weasel might have to approach your device 5 or more times before a detection or a capture. So these are incredibly cautious creatures that we need to really be careful about how we manage, hence that attention to detail. If we look at the next slide, this is what I want to talk about, is how we use these tools, because how we put these tools out in the bush will dictate how successful we are at seeking that outcome or achieving the outcomes that we seek. You can't just plonk your devices out in the bush and hope that they'll do the business. There's a bait station in the middle of the screen there. What you don't want to do is need the Sir Edmund Hillary of rats to be able to get into your bait station. Give them a chance. Set your devices so that they're going to work for you. And that's what I want to cover now. There's no point in having kit out there that isn't as sharp as possible. We owe it to our sponsors and to the energy of all the people who are contributing to predator control in New Zealand to make sure that every device we've got out there is as absolutely sharp as possible and is going to catch if it can. And that comes down to where we put these traps. I work with some very clever trappers, and in my time I've met some absolute geniuses who just know how these animals operate, and they've told me a lot of things about where to put traps, game trails, ridges, saddles, creeks, log crossings, roadsides, culverts, places that pests are going to be. But how you set them, along the linear features of the landscape, on the game trails, along the walls, along the fences, next to the roadways where predators so often hunt for roadkill. It's really important to locate your traps carefully. It's true that 80% of predators are caught by just 20% of the traps, and there's something about those 20% of the traps, the way they're set, the place they're set in, that makes them better. So if they're not catching, don't be afraid to move them, and you'll be surprised how short a distance you sometimes need to move them just to make them so much better. cold, damp places aren't usually very exciting for a little animal whose motor's running at 10,000 revs per minute. They don't like to be cold and wet, so maybe shifting them across the creek or out into the sunlight or up onto a slightly drier terrace. Little things like that can make all the difference. Foot predators like cats and ferrets and stoats, they prey on things like rabbits and rats, and those animals, when they're foraging, they're skitching around the turf or the leaf litter. Scuffing the ground can make an awful amount of difference to exciting the predator about your new trap set. Every time you check your trap, you've got to set it like your life depends on it. You've got to make it as exciting as possible. Scuff the ground. Those of you who work where there are robins around, you'll know that if you kick a patch of leaf litter up, there'll be a few little amphipods or invertebrates exposed, and a robin will often hop down to where you've kicked the leaf litter to explore for prey items. It's no different for predators. If you scuff the ground, you'll create that little bit of freshness, that little bit of excitement. So you should never just look in the trap, see that there's nothing there, see that an egg is still in place, and then move on. You should always attempt to do something to freshen that up, to make it more exciting. If we look at the next slide, Nick, I hope you're still with me.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly am.
We're exploiting the scent thing now. Scent is incredibly important to all of our mammal predators. They follow scent trails. They pick up on scent cues. Scenting your trap lines and scenting your traps is incredibly important. We all know that dead stoats give off that real musky, skunky sort of smell. Rub it all over your trap. Rub it on the trees. If you caught a rat or you've got a bit of rabbit gut, the reason predators often eat the gut first is because there's lots of mineral nutrition in a gut. So gut is really exciting to a predator. Rubbing a bit of rat gut or rabbit gut on a tree beside your trap or on your trap can just enhance that excitement. I often use scented sweetened flour, so a bit of icing sugar and a bit of flour with some aniseed oil or some peach oil just smeared on trees around the trap site will attract rats and mice to the site, which in turn will attract things like predators, stoats and cats and possums. The more activity you've got around your trap sites, the better. So again, it's about excitement, it's about a freshness, it's about attracting. Lubing your traps with attractive oils can also help. Things like salmon oil or linseed oil or cooking oil. They'll help make sure that your trap works when a predator goes in. The last thing you want is a trap that's rusted shut or has had poor maintenance. Beeswax or lanolin can all help with that. It's these attention to details that really make the difference between a trap that's going to catch and a trap maybe that doesn't. Co-locating your devices, bait stations, Dot 200s, Tims, Sentinels, any of those warrior traps. Often if you set up these nightclubs where everybody comes to party because there's something interesting going on, particularly during the possum mate in March, April, possums are very social creatures, very promiscuous creatures, so other possums are incredibly exciting, other pests are incredibly exciting. So all these things are just eking out that slightly better outcome. If we move to the next slide, Nick, I'd like to introduce one of Turangi's predator control legends. Many of you will have heard of Shirley Potter. This is a little video that I'd like Nick to play just to show you the emphasis on scenting. Shirley dragged the stoat and some rabbit guts in a bag tied to the stoat on this track line, and I'll just get Nick to play it, and then we'll talk about what happens when he tells me it's done its dash. This is about scent trail marking. What Shirley is doing here is she's setting up a scenario where a predator is chasing a wounded rabbit through the bush. The rabbit guts and the smell of the stoat is all along her track line. And Shirley caught 4 stoats and 1 weasel, I believe, on this track line the next time she checked it. And she thought I was kidding when I suggested that this might be just another 1% increment in improving her track line. So I know some of you probably already use this technique. It's commonly used by the gamekeepers in Scotland. Scent trails. Animals use scent. They track down scent. I don't know how many of you have been able to watch James Russell's video on the Cacophony website using thermal imagery and how animals follow scent trails. Rats set up a scent trail to a device, and then hedgehogs and possums all cue in on that scent, and they follow those scents. So don't underestimate the value of scent in sharpening up your track line, making it as good as possible. We're ready to move on then, Nick?
We sure are. I'll go to the next slide after her. Here we go.
So I wanted to also talk about mast shears, because I say it's not about numbers, but boy, sometimes our forests can just get loaded with pests. Historically, these mast shears were incredibly important to our native wildlife. This is silver beech seed in the photo here. When silver beech seeds like this, the kakariki, used to breed very, very prolifically. But it's not just beeches that mast. If we go to the next slide, and this is what happened last year in the Central North Island, we had a mega mast of polycarp fruit, a kahikatea, and metal down the bottom. A katamu was also very, very prolific. These mega masts often occur once in a generation. I think the last one in the Central North Island, as big as 2019, was in the early 1970s. These events drive massive rodent plagues, and the next slide was some photos taken last year. Can you see those, Nick? Is that A24 up with some other snap traps?
Sure is.
So these are the sorts of rodent plagues that occurred in our forests last year. And again, while we might feel good about seeing that number of dead animals in our bush, the tragedy was that that wasn't a patch on what was still out there, still running around. And so while we did see kaka breeding last year and keridu had 2 clutches, this rat plague fueled a stoat plague, and there have been a lot of stoats seen in the bush this last spring and summer. And a lot of that gain from the super mega mast has probably been undone by the mega mast that stoat plague that it generated. It's very sad, but it emphasises this point that it's not how many you kill that matters, it's how many are left, and it's the outcomes. So next slide. I guess I just want to sum up everything I've said, brushed over really, is that doing nothing is not an option, and that's why so many of you are on the webinar right now and so many of us do what we do. It's not about the numbers, it's about being outcome focused on scenes like the keridu in my broom bushes last spring. Attention to detail is key on our track lines. If we can make them as sharp as possible, we'll kill more pests, but more importantly, that'll leave less in the bush to create the outcomes. And it will give our sponsors and our contributors some confidence that the energy they're putting in is actually making a difference. But it is a long game. It's taken centuries for New Zealand decline to become so apparent, and it might take many decades for us to get it right again. My congratulations to all of you who are doing God's work out there and protecting these treasures that are so vulnerable to predators. And hopefully there's been 1 or 2 things in my presentation today that might help you make that 1 or 2 or 3% difference to sharpening your networks. And I'll go to questions and comments if you've got any there, Nick.
Fantastic, Cam. Thank you. Brilliant work. Okay, I've got a couple of questions for you that have come through. Could you be a bit more specific about best trap placements that help according to you? I know you touched on it a bit.
Yeah, I guess the problem is that everybody sees the bush differently. When I walk through the bush, what I see is different to what my kids see and my partner sees and people I take in the bush. So I see the forest and the bush with an ecologist's eye. When I'm thinking about rats and stoats, I'm thinking about how they operate within the forest environment, the game trails they use. Because I'm also a hunter, I'm often cued into what deer are doing in the bush, how they're moving from their beds to their feeding areas and back again. And I translate that into how I set my traps. So it's a very intuitive thing. But if you can imagine that animals don't just randomly cruise around the forest. They follow game trails, they follow linear features, they know where to look for prey in hollow logs or in tree stumps or along stream banks where there might be a colony of Norway rats. Or so if you put your head in the mind of a stoat through the forest, or the mind of a rat in the forest, you'll be able to think, how are they using this forest, and how should I set my traps to best exploit how that occurs? Putting little lollies out, little treasures out for them all over the place, little treats, little knobs of mutton fat, something that I've really latched onto this year because the wasps have been terribly bad this last few months, and they're stealing all my protein bait. So they don't seem to cut off the mutton fat. It lasts in the heat, and the mutton fat I'm able to smear on everything on a little tree stump, and it starts to cue predators in on the smell of mutton fat, and then suddenly there's a nice little lump of mutton fat sitting in a trap. So the short answer is I can't explain the intuitive observational things that I look for in the bush about where I set, but I know that so many sets don't catch anything and so many catch lots, and it's about trying to duplicate the best thing. Linear features in the landscape and running your traps parallel those linear features like logs, like fences, like roadways, like culverts, like stream beds. It's a good starting point. Look for warm, dry locations, not cold, wet, damp locations.
Another question, a simple one that I've just seen, is peanut butter. We're all using it, but is that the one? What's your take on peanut butter?
Mix it up a bit. Always mix it up. If you overuse a single tool, it becomes blunt. And so you need to change up your bait, change up your traps, change up your sets. We all know that the rat in the garage that's eating the walnuts is there to eat walnuts, and if he gets scared with peanut butter, he won't go near peanut butter or go near the trap that had the peanut butter. So I have to change my trap, I have to change my bait, and I have to change my location when I miss the rat that's eating my walnuts. It's the same out in the bush. You've got to mix it up. Peanut butter's great. Try mutton fat. It's amazing. It's just amazing. And I got that by watching Alone in the Arctic, where the wolverine, which is like a ferret on steroids, this guy who won it, he shot a moose, and he put all his moose up on a high frame, and the wolverine came. It didn't steal his meat, it stole his fat. So when I had wasps stealing all my protein, I thought mutton fat might be the go, and it's, for me this year, it's been a revelation.
Here's one that says, what do you think of terracotta or plastic scent lures? Any experience?
No, but because terracotta is porous, I suspect that it would hold the scent. So, yeah, definitely worth giving it a go. You want to use all sorts of different lures, and there's some great spray-on lures now of rabbit and fish oil that seem to be highly attractive and long-lasting. All I can say is mix it up and try stuff. And if you're not catching, put a game camera on your sets and make sure that you're not catching because you've got no critters or because the critters just aren't doing what you're doing. Some of the most important lessons I ever learned is watching my traps at night through videos or night vision camera. And if you look and watch how an animal interacts with your device, it'll change the way you set your devices. I spent some time on Little Barrier Island while the kakapo feeding program was going, and I spent a night in the hide watching the kiordi playing around the kakapo feeding stations. And there were traps set all around those feeding stations, and the rats just danced around the traps and waited for the kakapo to come to start throwing kumara and nuts and stuff out of the feeder. And once I'd watched that, it changed the way I set those traps around the kakapo feeding stations, and the trap catch went right through the roof. So, a colleague of mine, we were working on the Mangatotsi project, put a video camera with night vision on a clear plastic tracking tunnel, and we watched a rat spend 40 minutes at a tracking tunnel stealing all the peanut butter that he could, and he left one set of tracks through at the very end after 40 minutes. So, watching those things can inform you about why your traps aren't working. So invest in game cameras if you've got them, and if you've got thermal imaging, as so many hunters do these days, use them. Watch your traps, watch your devices, and understand how your animals interact with them.
Great advice. What success have you had with Good Nature A12 traps?
Mixed, very mixed. The can catch a few rats, definitely a few stoats, but I've had mixed results, and I know a number of community groups who have got a little bit frustrated. And again, I think it's about mixing it up and trying different stuff. And if it isn't working, do something different. If you always do what you've done, you'll always have what you've got. So change is the critical factor. And talking to someone like Sam Gibson at Good Nature, it's always a bit of an eye-opener to get a few tips about how to make the best of that tool. There's no silver bullet. All of the tools have advantages and limitations and consequences, and it's about trying to get the best out of them. So I run a number of different traps here at home, and I still think the Doc 200 is my greatest catch. Well, actually, the Victor number one, the Victor rack trap by my walnut cage in my garage is probably the most successful. But yeah, all of the traps can catch and all of the traps can fail depending on your attention to detail.
One from S. Bain says, do you ever chuck the dead rat in the bait cavity?
Yeah, all the time. I hear a lot of people doing the aerial burial. Like when they catch one, they stand at the trap and they hoof it as far as they can away from the trap. I always rub the dead animal. I slit its gut open with a pocket knife and I rub it all on the trees around the trap site, all over the box. I try to make the most of that critter. Yes, it goes a bit manky, but for at least a couple of days, it's going to attract more animals to the site. So, yeah, every catch is a potential success for the next victim.
Here's one for you from Sue Boyd. I have problems, she says, with slaters or tiger slugs eating the bait. She just wants to know, have you ever had that? And have you got a solution, maybe?
Oh, yeah, pellet baits, especially cereals and grains. Slugs and snails, I love them. Fats, they don't like fats at all because it interrupts with their mucus. So oily baits will help with that. You can imagine that the mucus on a slug really doesn't like greases and oils. I suspect my mutton fat idea is not going to get hassled by slugs and snails. So, if you're getting problems with slugs and snails, try the oily baits.
That's a good answer. Here is another one. I've been advised that a new trap should not be moved for a period of time, as stoats will take a while to trust the new arrival in their domain. And do you agree with this comment?
When you stick out a line of tracking tunnels to do a long-term monitoring program, the protocol is that you leave them in place for 6 weeks before you open the trap so that the animals can get used to it. There's some basis for that advice, but I move my traps all the time if they're not catching. I know that there are rats and stoats and cats and ferrets all around my place. I see it at night with my spotlight. I hear them in my roof, rolling my walnuts around. I have cue cards out that tells me they're there. If I'm not catching, it's because I'm doing something wrong or my trap's not right. So to a point, leave it, let it settle. If it's not catching, don't be afraid to shift it. And sometimes you don't have to shift it far, but make sure it's not in a cold, damp place.
Here's one from David. Cam, what tried and true attractants do you have for possums?
I like my lured flour recipe. 10 kilos of flour, 1 kilo of icing sugar, 1 kilo of milk powder, 150 grams of peach essence mixed up in a plastic rubbish tin. and I smear that over everything when I'm doing rodent or possum work. The white is a visual cue, and once they get there, the treat of the sugar, the protein, the starch is highly attractive. They get it on their hands and their fur. They go and communicate it to their mates, and they go, "Whoa, George, where'd you get that stuff? That smells good." So once your animals have got that stuff on their whiskers and their hands and paws, and they're communicating with other animals, you'll cue other animals onto that. So lure up your trap sites. Don't be afraid. Don't put flour on your bait stations or on your traps because it'll go mouldy and cause maintenance issues. But lure up the trees around, create those pest nightclubs, create that interest and that excitement.
Theo has said, it's like a cooking program all of a sudden. Theo said, can you repeat that recipe, please? He wants to write it down. So just one more time with that recipe.
Okay. 10 kilos of plain flour, 1 kilo of icing sugar, 1 kilo of milk powder, and 150 mils of peach essence. And that mixes up into a potent little brew that you can put a handful on your hand and smear it up the trunk of a tree. And it'll mix into the bark and impregnate the bark with that scent. And once your animals have got that in their fur and on their whiskers and on their paws, they'll communicate that excitement to the whole local populace.
Here's one from Steve. What do you think about using multiple baits in the same trap? I think you've covered it a little.
I still think that the Pindone Ferretox mixture is one of the gold standards for rodent and possum control. It's very hard to beat, especially if you lure up your sites with lured flour on the trees around your bait station. So, yeah, I think those two are particularly valuable as a combo rodent possum kill. If you haven't got access to a controlled substance license, then you can't use Ferretox, but Ferrocol is a good one. But you need to pre-feed it a little bit carefully because it has an appetite suppressant and they'll stop feeding after a reasonably short time. So you got to make sure they ingest a lethal dose. And it will deal with your rats as well. But the chalkiness, the calcium of it makes it has a you got to be careful they eat enough of it.
Here's one. It's from Bruce, and he asks, what's the most effective possum trap that you think?
Oh, I love the Victor #1 lead cold trap. It's probably the most important possum control device in New Zealand. You've got to check those every day, obviously, and that doesn't work for a lot of community groups. But those kill traps, the Sentinels and the Warriors, the Tims, there's a new one, the D-Max Tims. They're all very good kill traps. You can modify them as well to target other species like cats. Probably not a good thing to say on a national webinar, but keep in mind, cats can be a target when they're feral and they can be devastating on some of our wildlife.
Here's one from Kate Turner, native species risk mitigation. Can you talk about the balance between your attention to detail regarding mitigating the risk of bycatch, i.e. the bait station was really low on the tree, because she's saying we can't do that here because of cotta. Suggestions?
To have that many kaka in the forest, that's awesome. Absolutely, non-target, especially non-target native species that we're trying to protect is really important. And it depends on what you've got, whether that be kiwi or weka or kia or kaka. I totally agree that we need to mitigate non-target catches as best we can. There are weka excluders that can be put on things like 200s, bait stations. I would argue that a bait station up high or a bait station down low is still going to be accessible. My point is that make sure the rats can get in them. Don't turn them into Hillary rats that have to climb up. This ingenious device put in place by a Rotorua community group where they have a little climbing rope that dangles out the front of the bait station that the rats can climb up. I thought that was just sheer brilliance. Shared to me by a gentleman and his wife at Rotorua middle last year. So, yeah, I 100% agree that we don't want non-targets. Even A24s have now been found to be potentially dangerous to kia and to kiwi. So, we do have to set them to the protocols that are developed by our experts, and Doc are on this all the time because their own staff are using these tools and developing these mitigation techniques for non-targets.
Have you had an experience, just came in from Tim, with the new AT220?
Only through some of my doc colleagues at Ohakuni, where they did a trial in a reserve at Taihape, and they had a couple in the forest outside the ranger station at Ohakuni. And good results for possums in the Taihape trial, I believe. And they did kill some predators around the ranger stations, but I suspect that rodents that live around the ranger stations get a bit cautious after a while, so that might be a learned behaviour rather than a track design issue.
Here's one from Murray. He says, "Hi Cam, have you got any tips for cats?" He's Murray from Great Barrier.
Yeah, for me, cats love rabbit guts, and dragging rabbit guts around the property and along the fence line, on the fence posts, and then baiting my live catch traps with fresh rabbit. We get cats dumped from Turangi on that end of our one-way rural road all the time, and we've got a constant battle with cats, and they are just absolute suckers for rabbits. However, this year I did have the problem with the wasps carting most of the rabbit off in a day or two. So I went to the mutton fat, and man, that has worked a treat as well. So live cage traps and mutton fat, but don't go past scent trails with rabbit guts.
Grant asks, how do you drag the guts around in a mesh bag?
Yeah, just tied on a string. Although when I'm working just around the little farm here, I'm actively carrying a partially gutted rabbit around, and I'm rubbing rabbit guts on fence posts and along different locations along my fence line. I've cut a narrow strip between the blackberry on my back boundary and my fence so I can fit my my Doc 200s in that gap, and so I tend to make little rabbit gut signposts all the way along the fence line, and when a cat crosses my fence line, he'll pick up on that cue, and it funnels them to the cat trap.
Fantastic answers, great questions. Because we're coming up to nearly 50 minutes, you have to be able to go and have a cup of coffee. You've done so well. Thank you also to the people who in the little text box there were answering some of the questions that people had during this webinar. You're such a good bunch of people, the way you help each other out. Really, I'd just like a summary from you, if we can, Cam, of just what you'd like to leave the webinar folk with, thoughts about for when everything settles down and we can get back out to our trap lines. Maybe just a couple of words of motivational wisdom.
I don't know about wisdom, but and for me, what drives me is I want to see flocks of keriru in my garden, and I want to hear the screech of kaka when I'm hunting in the Kaimanua Beach Forest, and I want to hear kiwi calling from my camp when I'm hunting and I'm lying in my pit dreaming of how much venison I'm going to put in my freezer tomorrow. And I want my kids and my grandkids to experience that in my lifetime. My mentors have seen the flocks of kaka and the Kaimanuas go from 25. The most I've ever seen is 7. And now, you might see 1 or 2. So I know the decline is in the wrong direction, and everybody who's out there setting traps, I take my hat off to you. You're doing an amazing job, and it's up to biologists and ecologists and trap professionals to help make sure that every single trap we've got set across New Zealand is as razor sharp as possible, and that we don't waste any of this energy and effort and resource that's going out into our bush, because it's so important. It's such an important task, and just keep at it. Thank you for your efforts.